Hey guys, welcome back to Coding with NJ. In this tutorial, we are going to learn to implement a fully functional shopping cart with both its front end, back end, as well as the database part. As a payment gateway, we are going to use Stripe as well. Another interesting thing that we are going to learn is a built-in API in the browser, which is called MutationObserver. Since we have a lot to cover in this tutorial, so without any further ado, let me give you a demo of this tutorial and then we will get straight into coding. So this is the landing page of our website. At the top you can see two buttons, shopping and view cart. If you click on this shopping, you will see what you are currently seeing. That is the list of items that you can buy from and add to the cart. If you click on this cart, you are going to be taken to the current status of your cart, which is empty at this moment. And as you can see, this checkout button is disabled as well because we have nothing to actually buy yet. The moment we add any item to the cart, this will get enabled and we can start the checkout process. Anyway, let's go back to the shopping. And if I click on any of these buttons, all these three items should now be added in our shopping cart. As you can see, they are over here. And the checkout button is enabled now. As you can see the total. If I like, I can change the quantity of any item and the price is going to get updated as well. And if I'm not happy with any of the items, I can remove it as well. Now if you try to enter any other value other than these digits, the value is going to automatically revert back to 1. So for example, if I try to enter any alphabet and enter, you can see I got 1 back. And likewise, if I put any negative value, it's again going to revert back to positive 1. Okay. Now let's click on checkout and see where it takes us. So it has taken us to the pre-built checkout session page from the Stripe. And you can see the amount over here, which is the same amount that was displayed in the shopping cart. Now if I fill in any details, some random email, card information, name on the card, again some random bits, United Kingdom and postcode. So the payment was successful and we got redirected back to our landing page. But if you notice over here in the address bar, we have a query string which shows the status to be of success. That means the client has successfully paid the amount. And the shopping cart got emptied as well. So we are going to recreate this today. I hope you would like it. Before we actually start coding, I think it's a very good idea to discuss the basic overall workflow of how things are implemented behind the scenes. The moment we type the URL in the address bar and hit the enter button, this is what we will see. All the items that you can see over here, they have actually been requested dynamically from the database server to be pulled in, and from there they are dynamically displayed over here. So that means the moment our DOM contents have loaded, a GET request using Fetch API is sent to the server, which in turn requests the database to get all the items in its database. The database responds back with all these items, which in turn server responds back to the browser. Then the browser displays them over here. When we add items to the shopping cart and then click on the checkout button, another fetch request is sent to the server, but this time it's a post request along with the information regarding these two data items in its body to the server. And this time, since it's a post request with information about certain items, the server will recalculate the value there because we don't want to leave the price calculation solely to the front end, because if we encounter some very clever client, he can quite easily make us sell products to them for the price 0.00. We don't want that to happen. So even though we are displaying it in the front end as well, yet we are again recalculating the price at the server, and once the server is satisfied with the price, the server will make a request to the Stripe with that amount to generate a session. If server is happy with that information, it will generate this session and send the information back to the server, and server from there only sends back the session ID back to the client. Once the client gets this information, this time client will make another request to the front end along with that same ID. Once the Stripe sees that ID, it will instantly know that it's a valid request, and now it can present that form that we just saw where the user can type in the card details, and the Stripe is going to detect the amount that actually server has asked it to detect, and our workflow is going to be completed. Either we are going to be directed to the success URL or a status of failure. Okay, that's all the talking. Now let's get our hands dirty with coding shooting. So let's get started. In our empty project folder, let's create two folders, one for the front end related stuff and the second one for the back end related stuff. And I'm going to name them accordingly as well. Let's start working on our HTML first. Let's create an Index.html file. Boilerplate code. Let's change the title. And obviously we are going to style that, so let's create a link for the CSS file. And we will definitely be using a JavaScript file. We yet have to create those files, but let's start working on the body. So let's create a menu section for those two buttons that you saw on the top, one for the shopping and other for the going to the cart. And basically those two buttons are actually anchor text styled as button. Let's remove href attribute because they are not supposed to go anywhere. And if you don't want that h sign to get appended in the URL once we click on any empty anchor tag, to do that we have to say on click equals return false. So this way no h symbol is going to be appended in the URL when you click on these anchor tags. And what should those anchor tags be saying? The first one is saying shopping and the other one was saying view cart. Next we need another section where we are going to display all the items available for buying. So let's call that section shop, and this section contains a div called item container. So basically we are going to append all the items inside this item container, and each item is going to be encompassed in its own div. But we don't need to put anything over here because we are going to dynamically load those contents. For that part we have to define through JavaScript. Let's move on to the cart section. Now this section is going to represent the cart as the class name obviously suggests, and the structure that I have chosen to display the cart is table. It gives more kind of consistent organization, that's why. So let's create a table and let's work on the heading part first. In the heading part we have one row, and if you notice over here the table heading consists of three elements: item, price and quantity, and its bottom border is black in color. So let's create three table headings. The first one says item, price, and last one says quantity. Now as we move on to the body part and start creating rows over there, you will notice that the body part consists of actually more columns than our heading row. So the rows in the body part consist of 5 columns per row. So that means we have to somehow stretch these 3 columns so that they occupy as much space as the body part rows. Therefore I'm going to put column span to 2 over here, because as you can see this item is going to consist of these 2 columns in the body part, the picture and the title. Then price is a single column in the bodies as well, and when it comes to quantity, again we have 2 columns. One is representing the quantity and other is representing the remove button. So we have to make this item stretch out to cover these 2 columns and the quantity to stretch out to cover these 2 columns. So that's why I have put column span to 2 for the first heading and I'm going to do the same for the quantity as well. Okay, we are done with table heading. Now let's move on to table body. Let's give it a class tBody as well, and let's give our table heading a class as well. Now again we have to leave this table body empty because all the rows that you see in the shopping cart area, these are going to be filled in dynamically. So that means we have to insert new rows in the table body through JavaScript. But we can definitely show the last row that represents the total. And if you notice over here, it consists of only one entity which represents the total, and there is nothing over here. So we are going to create last row with only just one column, and we are going to make it spawn throughout the row. So that means its column span is going to be 5 because in total there are 5 columns in each row. So let's create. And since it's a unique row, so I'm going to give it a class name. This is going to make it much easier for the JavaScript to identify that row. Let's call it total row. And we have one table data column over here, which represents the price, which is currently 0.00. Let's give it a column span of 5 so that it stretches out and covers the whole area of a row. Okay, that's it with the table part. Now let's move on to the checkout button, which comes after the shopping cart table. Let's give it two classes, one representing button and other is going to say checkout button. The reason I've given it two classes, one is button and other is checkout button, is that if you notice in the project, we have a checkout button over here. Then in the shopping area, we have an add to cart button. So there are two buttons which have same kind of styling. So I'm going to define that common styling in the button class, and the things specific to the checkout button are going to be represented through the checkout button class. And that is all the HTML we need. Let me put defer in the script tag, so that it doesn't start executing unless the DOM has been loaded in the memory. Okay, so we are done with the HTML part, but let's create that JavaScript and CSS files. Let's see how our HTML currently looks. Okay, this is how it currently looks. Now before we start anything else, let's apply a little bit of styling so that at least we can see these two anchors look like as buttons and they appear in the middle of the browser. Okay, for the styling, let's first of all remove all the default margin and paddings associated with HTML elements so that we can give them our own if we like. And let's set box sizing to border box so that any margin and padding that we define for any box, that is going to consist of the total size of the box. Now for the HTML tag, only set the font size to 62.5%. Setting the font size to 62.5% makes the font size consist of 10 pixels, and then if we say 1 rem, that means 10 pixels, 1.5 rem, that means 15 pixels, 2 rems, that means 20 pixels. So it's easier, the font size calculation becomes easier. So therefore we set font size to 62.5%, and then for different HTML elements we define the size in terms of rems. Now let's work on the body part. Let's give it a padding of 4 and 8 rems respectively. So the 4 for the top and bottom and N for the left and right. Let's hide the overflow X. Text align to center. Background color Font family, I'm just going to go for sans serif, which is built in. Nothing fancy there. And text transform to capitalize. This way I don't have to consistently worry about making this word capitalize or not. Everything is going to be automatically capitalized. Now let's work on the menu section in which we have those two anchors. So again, text align to center. Font size is 4 rem, so that means around 40 pixels. And let's define margin. Top and bottom 3 rems. And for the left and right, there is no need. Now let's work on our actual anchor in the menu section. Let's remove the decorations. So that means the underline that usually is associated with anchor tags. Background color to light salmon. Some paddings. 1.5 frame and 2.5 frame. Let's see how it looks. Nothing seems to have changed over here. I wonder why. Well, the reason is this: if you pay attention over here, this is script file and the style file, they are inside this front-end folder, but our Index.html file is actually outside the folder. So that means it's in the main project folder, and we are saying that style.css should be where our Index.html is, which is not the case. So let me move this in the front-end folder. It should work now. Okay, now it says cannot get /index.html because we moved it to front end folder. Obviously, it's not there anymore. This is how it currently looks. What we need to do is we have to smooth out these corners and give it some border shadow so that they look more like a button. So let's give it border radius 0.5 frame and box shadow. Let's say 10 pixel for all the attributes. And for the color, let's define a shade of gray. Let's see how it looks. No shade though. Okay, it's not box sizing, it's box shadow. Okay, now this gives an impression of a button that can be pressed. Do you think we should change the text color as well? Maybe we should. So let's define color, which is purple. Okay. Okay, we are done styling these two anchors. Now what we next need to do is that we have to attach event listeners with these two anchors so that when you click on the shopping, we only see the section consisting of shop, and when we click on this cart, the shop section disappears and only the cart section appears. Remember, our shop section currently is empty. However, these three titles and the total price and this checkout button, they are all in the cart section. So only when we click on this cart button, these three things should appear, and we click on this shopping, nothing should appear on the page because currently our shop section is completely blank. So let's attach those event listeners. And since we have to work on JavaScript for that, let's get references to both of these two anchor elements. So let's give them some classes name first. This way it's easier to get the reference through the JavaScript. So let's give it a class name of shop button, and this one should get a class name of cart button. Now let's get references to those two anchors. Now let's define event listeners for both of these references. We are defining event listeners for the click event. Now what should happen when the shop button is clicked, well, in that case, if we are on the cart view page, then we should get back to the shop. If we are already on the shop button, then nothing happens. To make that happen, we need references to the section shop and section cart as well. So let's define those references first. We have given class shop to the shop section and cart to the cart section. Okay, now let's work on the event listener. So when the shop button is clicked, we want cart section to disappear. By setting its display property to none, and we want shop section's display set to block. Okay, now when shop button is clicked, cart section disappears and shop section appears. Now we want similar event listener for the cart button as well. So this time when the cart button is clicked, then we want shop section disappear and we want cart section to appear. Okay, let's go and verify. Nothing seems to have changed. Let's go and check. There is spelling mistake. Okay, when I click on the shop button, everything disappeared. Let's click on view cart. Okay, now you can see we are on the cart section. So that means our event listeners are working. Next, we need to work on our shop section and bring in all the items that are available to be shopped. So for that, we have to get hold of those items, and those items are in the database. So we are going to make a fetch request to the server to give us those data items. And since server has to request database because the objects are in the database, that means the next thing that we should do is define our database. Since it's a very basic database with just one table, I've already defined the table so that we can save some time filling in some data in it. Let me just show you by opening my workbench. Now if you notice, there is a database named shopping_cart, and in the tables part we have only one table named products, and it has an ID column which is unique, title, prices, and images. So we have to create a folder in our front end with the name images, and within those images folder I'm going to create subfolders. One is going to be the named bakery, and in that folder we will have an image named bread.png, cake.png, and croissant.png. Then we will have another subfolder dairy with cream, milk, and yogurt pictures. Another subfolder named fruits with all the fruits in it. Likewise, we have two more subfolders, poultry and vegetables. Okay, so I already have that folder in some other project I was working on. So let me grab it from there and put it in the front end folder. Okay, now you can see we have a folder named images, and within that folder we have subfolders bakery, customers, dairy, fruits, poultry, vegetables, and within those subfolders we have all the items that you can see in the database table. Anyway, the point is that we have a database named shopping_cart, and within that database we have a table named products. So we are going to get all the data which is available over here and display it in the browser. So let's go back to our JavaScript file and make a request to the server to give us that data. Now the question arises, where shall we define this request? I mean, we are not clicking any button to make that request happen. That request is automatically made the moment the front end, the Index.html page gets loaded in the memory. So that means the most suitable place for making that request is Windows DOM content loaded event listener. So we are saying the moment the DOM contents are loaded in the memory, at that instant a fetch request should go to the server to give us the data in the database so that we can display it in the browser. So let's go at the top and define an event listener for window object. Now since we are defining DOM content loaded event listener anyway, it's a good idea to put all the code within that event listener. So that means everything should happen after the DOM contents have been loaded. Okay. Now let's make a fetch request. The first parameter to the fetch is the address where we will find our server. So let's define that address. Since I'm running my server on localhost port at 080, you can change the port if you are running your server on some other port. Another spelling mistake. Then, as we intend to put everything related to the backend in the folder named backend, so backend, and then the name of the PHP file that is going to represent our server. So I'm going to call my server as myserver.php. This file currently doesn't exist. We have yet to create it, but this is the name that we are going to give to that file. Okay. The next one are going to be the parameters that we are defining for this particular fetch request. The most important one of which is what kind of method we want to send this HTTP request with. So the method is get, and since it's a default method, if you don't put it, it's still going to work, but I'm going to put it anyway. Now headers. In the headers we can define different HTTP related headers. So I'm going to define content type, since I'm going to send the data as a JSON object and expect the data to be received as a JSON object. So we have to specify application JSON, and we should define another header in which we will inform the server that we expect the data to be of JSON type as well. The next part usually is the body, but since it's a GET request, we don't need any body. So this is all we need to define for the request, for the HTTP request that we are sending with the fetch API. Now once we get the response from the server, it's going to come as a promise. So that means we have to use a then block, and this response is going to contain a bunch of things. All we are interested in is the actual data that has been sent by the server, and since we expect it to be in the JSON format, so we have to change it to JavaScript. This JSON method again returns us a new promise, so that means we need another then block. This time we have only got data, and over here we have to define what are we going to do with the data. So we made this fetch request to get that data and display it in the browser. So now we have to work on that part. This data is going to go in the shop section, and each table row that we have received contains all the information regarding one product. So what we need to do, we need to create new divs. Each div will contain data specific to one product, and we will keep on appending those divs in the shop section. Since we have got an array of products, we can use for each loop. Okay, now we are saying each product that we are getting from this data, whatever we define here should happen to that product. So the first thing that we need to do is that we have to create a div element. So const, we have to use create element method, and we have to tell what kind of element we are creating. We are creating div element. Since we will be applying styling to each of these divs to appear as a card on our screen, so we have to give it a class name as well. So we are going to give it a class name item. Now each div is going to be recognized by a class name named item, and if we apply any styling to this item, it's going to be get applied to all of those divs. Now if you remember, in the products table we had a column named ID. So this is the unique identification for each product. Even though we are not displaying that ID in the browser, we need to have that ID still associated with those elements behind the scenes. This is going to come in handy later on. We will get to that part when we get there, but we have to somehow find a way to keep that IDs intact and attached to these elements even though we are not displaying them. So in a sense, we are keeping the ID hidden from the customers that come on our website, but this information is still available there. So for such things, we have to define our own attributes. and we can define new attributes for any of the HTML elements through the methods named setAttribute and getAttribute. So I'm going to set an attribute named item ID, and I want to give it the ID that I'm going to receive from the product variable, and this product is actually a JavaScript object with multiple fields. First one of them is ID. So the ID that has been sent from the database, I want to store that ID as an attribute which is named item ID. This will come in handy later, but right now it won't be shown on the front end. In fact, it will never be shown on the front end. Now let's populate this div with the rest of the information. So I'm going to use inner HTML, and I'm going to use backtick because it's going to be lots of text and other HTML elements and JavaScript objects. So backtick is the most appropriate. The benefit of using backtick instead of these quotation marks is that within this backtick I can actually use variables, and those variables will be replaced by their values. And the other thing is that I can define contents on multiple lines as well. Okay, so if you remember in the browser, each product consists of a picture, a title, price, and a button to add it to the cart. So that means first thing is that we have to define an image attribute within this div element. And since we know that our images are in another folder named images, so we have to append dot and slash to represent current folder, and within current folder we have another folder named images, and rest of the path comes from product dot image field. So that's the column. Then the closing bracket for the image tag. Okay, now next we need a h3 tag, and this one is going to represent the title. Then for the price we are going to use spawn element, and let's give it a class named price so that later on we can apply styling to it. Since the price starts with the currency symbol, so let me put $sign. Now this $sign represents the currency symbol, but for the string interpolation we need another $sign, and over here product.price. Now if you notice, the prices are 120, 500, so the prices over here matches the format which is accepted by the Stripe, which is the lowest currency denomination. For the $sign it's cents, so this is 120 cents, 500 cents. But when we are displaying it for the customers, this is not most appropriate way to display. So that means we have to convert back into dollars. So dividing it by 100, because there are 1000 cents in each dollar, so dividing it by 100 will give us the price in dollars format. Then next we are displaying items per kg. So I have put /kg. You can put anything you like, but let's keep it simple. Okay, now let's add a button which when clicked adds this item to the shopping cart. Let's give it class btn for general styling and add btn for specific logic to this button. The caption is add to cart. So in the inner HTML of the div that we created, we are creating 4 elements: image, h3 tag, span, and button. Now we have created and populated our div element. All we need to do is that we have to attach this to our DOM, and exactly where in the DOM we should attach it. So let's go to the Index.html file. We have to attach it somewhere in the shop section, and if you remember, we have created this empty div and we said that we are going to insert all the products that we are going to display in this div. So let's go and create a reference to this div first. Call it item container. class is item hyphen container. Now use item container reference and append child, which is div. Now let's go and see. I hope I haven't made any spelling mistakes. I'm definitely wrong. Okay, so I might not be wrong. The thing is this, we have only created the front end logic, but there isn't any server yet that is listening to this request. So now we need to do is that we have to work on our server. So let's go to the backend folder and let's create a file named myserver.php. Now before we work on this myserver, let's create another folder for the database connection. Let's call it dbconnection.php and let's create a connection with the database. So first of all, let's define some variables. Since the database server is listening on port 3306, let me show you. As you can see, the database connection is listening on port localhost port 3306. You have to use the port on which your database server is running. This is the default port for database server. If you have changed your port, then you make sure you put that port number there. Next, we need a database name. So in our case, it's shopping_cart. Now username and password. Mine is root for both username and password. Now let's create a connection to this database. So I'm using MySQLi. We have to check if we actually got the connection or not. So if there is any error number, then echo something went wrong, and let's put the error number. Now exit, else we have the connection. Let me replace it with comma. A semicolon at the end is missing. Okay, now the first thing that we need to do is that we have to bring that code in our myserver file. Okay, we need from the same folder database connection.php file. Okay, now let's set our headers, and currently I'm setting content type header to application JSON for the time being. Okay, now let's work on accepting the request from the client and making another request to the database and sending the data back to the client. The moment we start the server, this file is going to be listening for any request. And since our front end is going to make two different type of HTTP requests to the same file, get and post, we need to be able to differentiate it so that we can send appropriate response to the client. So the first thing that we need to do is that we have to check if the request that we have received is it of type get, and to do that we have to check if the server super global variable request method is actually get. So if the request that has been made to the server is through an HTTP GET request, In that case, whatever you define over here is going to happen or execute. In this particular scenario, getting a GET request from the browser only means one thing, that is, give me the data to sell so that I can display it. Okay, now in turn we need to communicate with the database server. We have already included the code for the database connection.php in our myserver.php. That means the connection variable exists over here. It's already there. We simply have to use it. Next we need to do is create a statement that we want to execute, and that statement is select everything from products table. That's it. Simplest statement. Now next we need to execute a query. So this statement is just a statement, nothing has happened yet. So what we need to do is that we have to use our connection object, because that is the connection with our database, and using that variable we are going to execute a query. And to execute a query, the method is query, and within the parentheses we have to pass the actual query to be executed. And since our query is in the statement variable, so let's pass that variable. And it is possible that this statement is going to return us some result. So let's store that result in a result variable. Now all we need to do is we have to make sure that there actually is some data in this result variable. So if result has a method named numRows, so if it is not 0 or not empty, in that case, the first thing that we need to do is that let's create an array variable. This is an empty array. Now what we are saying, that one by one fetch each request as an associative array and store it in a variable named row. And we can save that by writing $row equals to result, and apply another method on result object, which is fetch underscore assoc. So what this is going to do is this method is going to extract one row at a time from the result object and convert it into associative array and stores in this variable named row. Now we have data related to one product in this row, and we are going to store that row as an object in the array. So this array is going to consist of an elements of type objects. To define an elements of type objects in PHP, we need to have a class of that type. So in order not to muddle our main server, let's create another file in the backend. Let's call it item.php. And this one is going to consist of a class named item with 4 fields corresponding to those in the database table. So we need a variable named id in our class, another variable named title, a variable named price, and a variable named image. Now let's define a constructor. And it takes 4 parameters: id, title, price, and image. And we are going to assign values to our class variables. So this id equals id, this title is assigned title parameter, and this price is assigned price parameter, this image is assigned image parameter. That's all. We don't need to do anything. All we need to do an object of type class with these values set. That's it. Now let's go back to main server, myserver.php, and let's add the code for that class in our server file as well. So now we have to take the data which is in the row variable now, convert into an object of type item and store that item in this array. So we are going to say you have to push it into array. So the first parameter to array underscore push is the actual array in which the data is going to be pushed. We have named our array as array as well. The next one is going to be an object of type item. So let's create an object of type. So new item, and let's start assigning values since our data in the row object. So row, and it's an associative array, so we can use the column names instead of the indexes. The second parameter is going to be the title. Third one is the price, and the fourth one is image. Okay, so we are creating an object of type item over here and pushing it into this array. So each time a row is read from the database result set, it's being converted into an object of type item and pushed into the array. So now our array is being populated with objects of type item. Once we are outside the while loop, that means we have populated the array with all the data that we received from the database. Now we are ready to send it back to the client from where the request came. And since client has already mentioned that it only accepts data of type JSON, so we have to encode this array as a JSON object. So echo JSON underscore encode. Okay, now this echo will send the response back to the client as a JSON string. So this ending curly brackets represents the if part, where we did get result from the database. If we didn't get result from the database, in that case, we can send a message that something went wrong and try again and terminate the program there. Now let's exit. I forgot to put else over here. Well, I have forgotten to put a semicolon over here. That's why the red line over here. Now it disappears. Something wrong. Another missing semicolon. Okay. So we are done with the first request with the get, and if I haven't made any spelling mistake anywhere, I should be able to see all the data in the browser. So far I've been displaying this project from the live server because there was only just front-end HTML, CSS and JavaScript. Now since the server is involved, I have to start a web server. So I'm going to go for the built-in server that comes with PHP. And since the port that we have decided is 8080, so let's go to this location. It's front end and Index.html. Okay, I still can't see the data. There is some kind of server related error, so I must have done some mistake, most likely the spelling mistake somewhere. The spelling mistake, IMAGE call to undefined method MySQLi fetch a sock. Okay, spelling mistake. Refresh. Okay, this is one product, this is second product. Let me close this. Now as you can see, all the items you can already see, but they are not styled, so that's why they look. The current styling that is defined is for the body part, which says display all the contents in the center, so that's why you can see everything in the center. However, there is no card like structure. Now all we need to do is define the styling for each of these products, and let's go to JavaScript. So the each item that we are receiving from the server, we are storing it in its own div, and we are giving it a class name called item, and this item is being appended to a div named item container. So now let's apply some styling for the item container and the items itself. So let's go to style.css. Let me push it down. Okay, for the item container we need to give it some padding, 2 times to top and bottom and 2 to left and right as well. The most important thing that we need to define for item container is set its display property to grid. And we want to set in the column style. And what kind of columns do we want? Let me write it, then I'll explain. So as you know, with grid, you can define each element inside the grid of different size and height. But if you use the repeat, that means whatever criteria you are defining, it's going to apply all of the elements of the grid. And usually repeat takes 2 parameters. The first one is going to be the total number of elements within one row. So if we had 10 over here, that means we want 10 columns in a single row. And for the second parameter, we usually define the width of each grid column. But here we have replaced the number of rows with out of it and the size with the min-max function. So this min-max function chooses between the minimum and maximum. So whatever is available, it goes for the maximum, which is 1 fractional unit, and if it's not possible, then it goes to make each column of size 30 rem. Now our grid is slightly flexible and it can choose between the two options. And this out of it means instead of having to have a fixed decision defined that each row should have 2 or 3 or 10 columns per row, it's up to the space. As many elements of this criteria can fit into the single row, fit them. For the rest, move them to the next row. So this is what this piece of code is telling us. Now we want a consistent space between each grid element. So for that we have to define grid gap property and we are setting it to 2 rems. Now let's work on individual columns inside the grid. Let's set its heading 1 rem top bottom and 2 rems left and right. Background color to white. Border radius 0.5 for smooth edges. Let's give it a box shadow. So I'm going to copy and paste it over here. The same box shadow that we have given to our anchor buttons at the top. Now let's work on the elements inside the item element or item div. So first element inside this item div is an image. So let's define its width and height. 28 rem. And we want our image to be positioned in the center within that defined width and height. So for that, object position to center, and we want this object to scale down and fit into that space. So object width is set to contain. Below our image we have h3 tag. Let's set its font size to 2.5 rems and give it a padding bottom 2 rems. Now spawn element, let's set its display to block, color to a shade of black, font size large and padding 2 rems all around. Okay, the only thing left for styling is the button, but let's see how it currently looks. There is something obviously wrong. There is a hyphen between auto and fit. Okay, much better. So now we are able to grab contents from the database and display it as a card on our landing page. Now the only thing left is we have to define styling for add to cart button. So let's define journal styling for a button and then we will see if we need any separate styling for the add button. because it's journal styling, so we need to go up. After the body, let's define a button because it's journal. Give it a padding of 1 rem and 4 rems. Margin bottom 1 rem, border radius 0.5 rem. Transition, so this is going to come in handy for the hovering effect. So as you remember, when we were putting the cursor over the button, we were seeing the blue width appearing. So we are defining this transition property for that 0.3 seconds to take, and the transition is linear. Let's define border. So we want the border to be 10 pixels in width, solid, but its color should be white so that we don't see any border unless we hover over it. Then we will change the color of the border. And outline, we are going to change the color of the outline to again shade of black. Outline style is solid. Font weight is going to be 700 and spelling mistake. Font size to be large. So let's see how it currently looks. Okay, so this is how it currently looks. If you notice, between this outline and the button, we can see the white space. What we need to do, we have to bring this outline around this actual inner button. And to do that, we have to set the offset for outline, means from where this outline should start, and we are going to set it to -10 pixels because outline comes after the border. And we have set the width of border to 10 pixels, so -10 pixels is going to bring it before the border starts. So now you can see we don't see any space. Now we need a hover effect so that when you hover over it, the color of the border changes from white to light blue. So let's copy the border property and change its color to light blue. Let's see what happens. Refresh, and you can see the blue border appearing. Okay, now next we need to define an event listener for our add to cart buttons so that when we click on this button, the respective elements gets attached in our cart. Now because these contents including this button is created dynamically, we cannot define and attach an event listener to it before it even exists. So we need to make sure that this event listener is attached to these buttons after they have been created and inserted into the DOM. And this is where MutationObserver API comes in. So MutationObserver API kind of works as a spy for you. If you tell your spy, that is your MutationObserver, that inform me as soon as these kind of changes happen in the DOM, then the MutationObserver, your spy, keep a close eye on the changes, and the moment those changes occur in which you have notified your interest, your spy will immediately inform you. So we want our spy, that is our MutationObserver, to keep a close watch and let us know the moment any item is added in the shopping section. When this happens, our spy is going to inform us, and then we will attach an event listener to this add button. So let's work on that logic now. Since we have used an analogy of a spy for our MutationObserver, let me create a variable named spy, which is actually going to represent MutationObserver. So this MutationObserver is a built-in class in our browser, and this MutationObserver takes a callback function as a parameter. We are defining that callback function inside the parameter. So this callback function is passed all the mutations that has occurred, and since there are going to be different kind of mutations, for example, a node has been added, a node has been deleted, contents of a node has been changed, or certain attributes of the nodes has been changed, like its display property set to null. So there can be different type of mutations. Therefore this mutations is an array. So we are going to iterate over all of these mutations and look for the mutation that we are interested in. So mutation.for each, and this for each again takes another arrow function, but this time a single mutation at a time. So the kind of mutation that we are interested in is when a new node is added in our DOM. Remember, we are creating this item div and inserting it into our main DOM. So when this new node has been appended, we want to be notified. And since this mutation can be of any type, so we want to be returned from this callback function if the mutation is of not our interest. So we are saying if not mutation dot added nodes. Now added nodes is one of the attributes of this mutation, and if its length is not equal to 1, that means no new node has been added, rather some other kind of mutation has occurred. In that case we are not interested, so just simply return. However, if a new node has been added, then we are interested. But first we have to make sure that this new node that has been added, if that node has been attached to the item container div, because all our items we are appending it in the item container div. So we have to check the target of this mutation. The target is going to give us the parent div in which new nodes have been attached. And how can we check if that's the same node? So we will check its class list. So we have to write if mutation.target. So target is kind of the parent node in which the new nodes have been added. So if mutations target dot class list contains, what is the class name of our div in which we are adding item divs? That is item container. So if the node that has been added, that node's target contain a class name item container, that means this is the node we were looking for, and now we can grab its fourth child, that is the button, and attach an event listener to it. So mutation dot added nodes, and since we know that the length of the added nodes is 1, that means at index 0 we will find the added nodes children, and since we know it has 4 children and the button is the last one, so the button must be present at index 3. To that element attach an event listener, which is click, and its callback function is add cart element. That's it for the time being for this mutation observer. We will keep on adding new logic to this one as we progress in our project. For the time being, we are done with the mutation observer callback function. Now all we need to do is that we have to tell the spy what kind of things it needs to spy. So remember, this spy doesn't know that what nodes it should be keeping an eye on. So now we have to tell the spy to observe certain nodes for changes. This observe method takes 2 parameters. The first one is going to be the HTML element on which we want our spy to keep an eye on. So in our case it's item container, and second one is the list of things that we want it to observe for. For example, if we set its child list property to true, it will keep on observing any new nodes directly attached to this container and nothing else. If we put attributes set true, that means if the attributes of that element changes, then the spy should also notify us, but we are only interested in the direct children that are attached to this item container. So here we are defining what happens if a certain kind of mutation happens, and over here we are defining what nodes should be observed for changes. The moment those nodes are changed, then this function should execute and that logic should be applied. Now we need to actually define this add cart elm function because we haven't yet defined it. Now within this function we have to define the logic for creating table rows and attaching it and attaching it to the table. But for the time being, let's display a console message to see that our logic so far is working properly. Let's refresh. Mutation observer is not defined. So it's not object, it's observer. We don't need a capital C over here, we need a small c. Okay. One more time, refresh. Now let's click. Okay, within add to cart listeners. So that means when these elements got added to the item container div, our spy kept a close eye, and the moment new nodes were added, it executed the callback function associated with it, and that function attached an event listener to all of these buttons. Okay, now we have to define the logic in the add to cart button so that it creates new table rows and attaches them to our table. Let me just remove this statement first. Since we are going to attach new rows to the table body, so let's create an element of type table row. And let's assign it a class name as well. We also need this table row to uniquely identify this particular item based on the ID that was sent by the server that uniquely identifies this particular item in the database. And to do that, we are going to define an attribute just like we did previously. The name we are giving this attribute is item ID. And where can we get that item ID from? Well, as if you remember, this add cart element gets executed when we click on the add cart element button. And that button element is inside the div which we dynamically created and gave it the name item. And while we were creating that div, we also set an attribute for that div with the same name, and it has the ID that it received from the server. So the parent of this button which triggered this add cart element is the same div, and that element has that ID. So we are going to get that ID from the parent of this button. So we are going to say this represents the button that was clicked. So this parent element get attribute item ID. So over here we are saying that the parent of the button that got clicked has an attribute called item ID, get the value of that attribute and assign it to the item ID attribute of table row. Okay, now after the attribute is set, now let's define its inner HTML with the backtick. So while giving the demo, we discussed that each row in the table body is going to consist of 5 columns, one for the picture, one for the title, price, quantity, and the remove button. So that means we need to create 5 table data items inside our table row. In the first table data item, we are going to display the image as a thumbnail. So let's give it a class name first. And where can we get the value for the source attribute of this image? Well, again, we are going to refer to the button's parent, and the first child of the parent is the image itself. So let's use a string interpolation. This parent element children, and since we need first child, so index 0, and we need the source value of that child. As the second TD content, we need to put the title over here, and that is going to come from again the parent. So this parent element children, we need to place one over here to give us the second child. Now we need to display the price. price comes from the third child. For the fourth table data element, we need to display an input field. So it's a new element. So let's define it. Type is number. And default value is 1 that is going to be displayed. So defining the type to be of type number ensures that we are not able to enter anything other than the digital values. As the last table data element, we need to display a remove button. So let's create one. Let's give it a class. We are not going to assign btn class to it because we are going to style it in a different way than the rest of the buttons in our project. So let's give it rmbtn as a class, and the caption is remove. We are done defining the table row. Now all we need to do is attach it in the table itself. So to attach it, we are going to use table body reference, and we are going to insert it before. So this insert before takes two parameters. The first one is going to be the node that we are going to insert, and the second one is going to be the child before which we are going to insert this new node inside the table body element. So the first one is table row that we are going to insert, and where do we want to insert it? So we want to insert it before the last child of this table body. So the last child of this table body is the row which is displaying the total amount. So we want it to be inserted before that. So we can say table body dot last child element. So insert this table row inside the table body but before last child element. This is what it's saying. Next we need to call update total function so that the total gets recalculated, but we have yet to define this function. So let me create an empty function so that we don't get an error. Okay, now let's check if we are able to insert a new row in the cart when we click on the add to cart button. Let's refresh and add fresh theme and some bread to our shopping cart, and let's view the cart. Okay, so we have failed to insert anything over here. Let's check what's wrong. Cannot read properties of the undefined on line 58. Okay, it's not child list, it's children. Refresh. Okay, so we can clearly see the images. That means we have been able to successfully insert new rows in the table body, but if you see over here, we don't see any contents, rather the data type of the children that we have placed there. So let's see what's wrong. Okay, the thing is this thing is called string interpolation, this $sign and then curly brackets. So whatever we insert there, it's going to be interpreted as a string as a final output. So this whole thing actually represents an object. An object cannot be displayed by the string interpolation. We need to pinpoint to one of its variables. Just like over here, while displaying the image, we have specifically pointed out that we are interested in the source attribute. So over here, we have to say something like that. Since the second child that we added to the item div was actually a h3 element, so this whole thing is actually pointing out to h3 element, and we need to extract the inner text of that h3 element. So we should say inner text. This is going to display the text properly in the browser. Now the third child is actually a span, so we need to be aiming for the inner text of the span as well. Okay, let's go and check. Refresh. Add these two elements. View cart. Okay, now it says wholesome bread and it also displays the price. Since the new rows has been added, now we have to style those elements so that look something like this, and then we will work on the update, and then we'll work on the update total function. So before we start styling, we have assigned a class name item row to each row that we are inserting, and item ID to the image that is being inserted in the table row as a thumbnail. So let's go and work on the styling. Since our table is in the card section, so let's start by styling our card section. We don't need much when it comes to styling card section. We just have to change the background color to white and set its margin to R2. Now let's define some styling for the table in general. Set it width to 80%, margin auto, and let's define the font size for overall table to 2.5 frames. Now for the table heading, we are going to set its border bottom so that we can see the black line underneath the titles. Solid 2 pixels and shade of black. We need a similar underline underneath each row but gray in color. Table row. Okay. And for the table heading, let's set its text align property to center as well. Let's see how it currently looks. Okay, so this is how it currently looks. If you notice, you can see the line breaking over here and over here. So since our table heading has 3 columns, so that's why we can clearly see where does one column ends and next column starts. So we don't want this, we want a consistent line throughout the table. So for that we have to use a property called border collapse in the table, because we want this to be applied to table rows as well. And set it to collapse. Now you can see there aren't any breaks in the lines. Okay, now let's start working on the table rows. Let's set the width for table headings as well as table data. So each column should consist of 33%, padding 1 rem and 2 rem respectively, margin 1 rem and 4 rems. Let's add some items to the cart. Now all we need to do is work on the individual items in the table data, changing the size of these images to thumbnail, and we also need to style this input field and the remove button. So let's work on the table data which contains an image. We could have used the class name that we have given to that image, but let's work like that. So you want image to be 14 rems in width and height as well. And we want the object fit property set to cover. Okay, brilliant. I want to move these titles to be slightly closer to the images. So what we need to do, we have to scrape the padding and margins associated with the right side of these images and left side of these titles. So let's go back to the image one and let's remove the right side padding to 0 and margin to 0 as well. Now we have to remove the left side margin and padding associated with the title. Since we haven't given any identification to the table data which is displaying the text, it's a simple table data with some text in it, so we need to uniquely identify it somehow. For that we have to say the second table data item in each table row, and to say that we have to say table data followed by colon and then nth child function, and because we are interested in the second child, so we have to put 2 over here. Now let's remove the left side paddings and margins. 0. We are also going to set a text align property to left. We have to use table data, not table heading. Okay, now that's better. Now let's start styling the input field. Since we have only one input field, so we can just write input, but to be even more specific, I'm going to say an input field whose type is number. So let's give it a round edges by setting its border radius 0.5 rem. Let's change the outline color and other attributes, light blue, solid, and let's make it 3 pixels in width. Remove the border, width 6 rem, height 4 rem, text align center. Okay, we can't see the outline. I wonder why. Oh, that's because I have put a comma there. Now we can see the outline in blue shade. We need to remove these 2 arrows, and to remove those arrows we have to use WebKit. Inner spin button, and we want the similar one for the outer spin button as well. So copy, comma, paste. Now inside those curly brackets we have to set WebKit appearance to none. So anything that starts with WebKit something, it means it's not a standard CSS. These are kind of facilities that have been specifically provided by the browser for you to perform something which CSS itself is lacking. Now you can see there aren't any more those arrows there. Now let's work on the remove button. We have given the class rmbtn to the remove button. Let's set its background color to be white, the same as the background color of the table itself. We have to remove the border, set its display to inline, and we have to set the position to relative because we are going to use after pseudo element which is going to be positioned relative to this one. Color red, font size 1.9 rem, font weight to 700. And let's see how it currently looks. So this is how it currently looks. Now we have to put a cross in the circle next to this remove button, and that we are going to use through the after pseudo element of this element. Color red again, border solid 2 pixels, gray in color. Remove the outline. Background color same as the background color of the table. Border radius we are going to set it to 50% because we want to turn into a circle. Width 28 pixels, height 28 pixels as well. Font size 2.5 rem, font weight 900. Content, the most important property of before and after pseudo elements. So we want it to look like a cross, and this value will make it look like a cross. Display is going to be inline block. We forgot to put the after pseudo element over here. Okay, so this is how it currently looks because an after element is supposed to come after the contents of the actual element, so you can see it underneath. And you can see this cross is not even properly placed as well. So we need to bring this whole thing next to the remove button and make sure the cross is exactly in the center. So for that we are going to change the display property to flex and set its justify content and align items to center. This is going to bring the cross exactly in the center. Now all we need to do is move that whole circle along with the cross to right next to the remove caption, and for that we have to set the position to absolute. Now this is going to be absolute with regard to the main content itself. So we want it to be pushed further down the left side. So setting it to 110%, and we want the top to be pushed up as well. So minus 30% should do the trick. Let's see. Perfect. Now everything looks good as long as the tables are concerned. However, we need this total and this checkout to appear at the rightmost side. So I think we have given name to the last field. Let's go and check So the last table row must have a name, or it says table row. So we are going to set its text align property to right. So total row text align to the right. We need to move this checkout button to the right and bring some margin between this table and the checkout button. But before we do that, we need to attach an event listener with this remove button, so that when we click on this remove button, either the word remove or this cross symbol, this item should get removed. So let's work on that. And we need to again get the services of MutationObserver. Okay, so here we were checking if the target element, that is the element in which the new node is added, does that contains a class name called item container. So that means if yes, that means it belongs to the shopping section. So now we have to apply a similar check, but this time for the table body. So if mutation.target class list contains table body, if that is the case, in that case we have to access its last child and attach an event listener to it. So mutation dot edit nodes, and only one row is added, so we can use last element child, add event listener, click, and let's define a callback function. We call it remove cart element. But this thing won't take effect unless we want our spy to start observing table body elements as well. I use this spy word for the MutationObserver to align with the analogy, but I think we should use the standard normally is followed. So we usually call it observer. I mean, you can keep it spy or anything else if you like, but I'm going to make it observer. Okay, now let's define this remove cart element function. And what it simply has to do is that means the remove button itself, access its parent element and simply remove it, and then update total. Okay, let's go and check if it actually works. Okay, now let's remove coconuts. Good, it's being removed. Okay, so before we start working on the update total, attach an event listener with the input field as well, because when the data in the input field is changed, we want an event to get triggered and it should update the total as well. So let's go back to the MutationObserver and add an event listener for the input field as well. So when a new node is added to the table body, then we not only want an event listener to the last element, that is the remove element, but we want a change event listener to be attached to the input field as well. And since input field is the fourth element, that means it's available at index 3. So we have to get a reference to that field first. Mutation edit nodes at index 0 children, and we want the fourth element that is available at index 3. Now that element is available in the variable quantity. We can manipulate it with the quantity. So quantity dot add event listener, and this time the event that we are listening for is change, any change in the value. So let's call it quantity change function. Let's define it. So first we have to check if the new data that has been entered into that input field, is it valid value or not. So it's not valid value if it's a negative number or quantity 0 is entered. In that case, revert back to 1. So if, let's pass the event which triggered this event listener. So if e.target.value is equal to empty, or starts with minus sign, or if it has been set to 0, in that case reset the value back to 1. You can't set it to value 0 because 0 means you want to basically remove it, and if you want to remove it, click on the remove button, and then you have to call the update total function, because if any other change has occurred or the initial value was 4 and you have set it to 0, then it will again be reverted back to 1. So in that case the total needs to be updated again. So in any case you have to call the update total function so that it can get recalculated and we can see the most updated value in the total on our screen. So that's the logic for the quantity change event listener. Now let's work on the update total. So for the update total logic, first of all we have to get hold of all the table rows inside the table except for the last row. And if you remember, when we were defining those rows, we were giving each row a class name called item row. So now using that class name, we can extract all those rows. Const rows equals document.querySelector all, because we have more than one row possibly, and each of them have a class name called item row. Now we've got all the rows which are currently present in the cart. Let's go through each of those rows one by one using for each function. And while we are going through those rows, we have to basically look for two pieces of information. We have to get hold of that input element, and we know that that input element is actually child of one of the table data elements in this row. So we are going to convert this row into an array by passing it to array.from function. And we have to specifically look for that whose first child is of type HTML input element. And we can do that by applying this find method on our array, and this find method takes another arrow function, and you look for any x whose first element child is instance of HTML input element. Remember that our input element is inside a table data. So this array consists of those table data elements. So we are going through all of those table data elements one by one, and we are looking for any such table data element whose first child is an instance of type input HTML input element. If that is the case, then that table data element is going to be returned. So we have to store it somewhere. We are going to call it element. Now from that element which contains the table data, we have to get into its first child, that is input element, and get its value, which is actually quantity. So I'm using the quantity variable to store it as well. So we are saying elm first element child, and we are only interested in its value. So value is one of the attributes of input element. Now since this value is actually a string, we have to convert it into integer. So for that we have to pass it into parseInt method. Now our quantity actually represents integer version of whatever value is in the input field. We have got one piece of information. Now we have to get the price, and we know that the price is actually the third data element in each row. So we have converted this row into an array already. Let's create a variable price, and from this array we have to access its third element. So third element means index 2, and we have to get its inner text, not the table data itself, but inner text, which is the actual price. This actual price consists of $sign appended to it, as well as / and kg at the end. So let's, from that inner text, replace $sign by nothing, which basically means remove the $sign. Now here the price contains still a string with only just the $sign removed, but per kg is still attached to it. Now next we have to remove that per kg from the price. To do that, we have to again use the replace function on the price. But this time what we are going to remove is more than a specific character. In fact, starting with a slash and anything followed by that slash, we want it to be removed. So we are going to pass it a regular expression. And we are saying that we want to remove anything / and everything after that should be removed. And it should be replaced with nothing. Now this price actually contains just the price, but it's still a string. So on the next line we can parse it through the parse float function. We should have created a variable for total at the top. Now update the total. So multiply quantity with price and add it to the current value of total. So this might give us a very large value after decimal point, and we want to restrict it just to 2 places after the decimal point. So for that we are going to use math.round function. Inside this round function, first we are going to multiply the total by 100. This is going to move the decimal point 2 places to the right. Then it gets rounded, and then we want the decimal point to be moved back to its original place. So again divide by 100. So this gives us total. Now outside this for each, we have to update the total on the screen as well. So let's go back to the Index.html. We have given a class named total row in which we are displaying the total. So we have to get reference to this table row through this class name. Cons total row equals document.querySelector total row dot inner text is equal to tick $, then the value total. Let's go and check. Already an error 91. So we are getting that error which says this element is actually elm is undefined. We are trying to get a value of this undefined. The reason is that this item row actually represents the whole table row element tr. And when we are iterating over that one row at a time, that is tr, here we want to say that convert it into an array, but we don't want a single tr to be converted into an array because it's already singles. So what we were interested is that we were interested in its children. So remember, the children of the row are table data, TDs. So we want those table data to be transformed into an array. So now this array contains its elements as table data elements, and from that table data elements we are looking for one specific table data element whose first child is of type HTML input element. I hope this will work now. Refresh. Assignment to constant variable 93. Okay, so price and quantity should be changed to let 99. Cannot set properties of null on row 99. Oh, that's because over here when we were getting a reference to table row, we forgot to put point over here. Now let's go and give it another try. Refresh. Add to cart. Okay, the price is 5.01. Go to shopping, add another element. The price has been upgraded to 9.22. Let's add one more element. Okay, 11.33. Let's remove an element. Price got updated. Let's change some value. It didn't change. So uncart e target value starts with an s is missing, so spelling mistake on line 80. Okay, now the price got updated, so everything is working properly. Let me put the word total over here in the update total function. Fresh, add to cart. Okay, so let's work on styling this total and the checkout. The table row which is displaying the total is given a class named total row, and I have set it to text align right. Why isn't it working? Okay, perhaps we have to set the text align property to right for the table data which is inside this table row. So we have to say any table data that is a child of table row class that should have a text align property set to right. We have to do the same over here as well. We were supposed to change the inner text of table data. Instead, we were changing the table row itself. I think it should be doing fine now. Refresh, add to cart. Finally, okay. Now this is sorted out. Now let's go and apply some styling to the checkout button. Disable it initially and move it to the right. And the moment the total changes to 0 again, the checkout should get disabled again as well. Checkout btn, margin left 68%, margin top 1.5%. Okay, let's make it initially disabled. I'm going to disable it from the Index.html file. Okay, so this is disabled. Now let's go to update total function. So here we will check what's the value of the total. If total is greater than 0, then select that button and set its disabled to false, else set it to true. So it's not actually style, so let me remove this style from there. Refresh, initially disabled, add something to the cart. Now it has been enabled. Let's remove this and it gets disabled again. So it's working properly. Now what we need to do is that we have to add an event listener to this checkout button, so that when you click on this checkout button, we actually get redirected to the STRIPPE page where we can enter the cart details. The checkout button is already there from the beginning, so we can simply get a reference to it and attach an event listener. So let me go up and get a reference to the checkout button. Let's go down and at the very end, checkout button dot add event listener, click, and I'm defining the callback right there as an arrow function. We have to iterate through all the items in the shopping cart. So let's create an empty array, items to buy. Now let's iterate through the elements in the cart. Each row is given a class named item row. So this item contains now all the rows, that is TRs. Let's change this name to item rows. Now this item rows contains all the rows. Now let's go through those rows one by one. So item rows for each row. Let's create an object, an empty object. Then ID is equal to, so we are going to get the ID from the attribute that we set. So row get attribute. The name that we have been giving to the attribute is item ID. So this is the reason we have been tagging along that ID that we received from the server in the first fetch request with everything, so that we can send that ID back to the server, because based on that ID now server will look for those items in the database and get their prices from there, because server is not going to rely on the price collected at the front end. Now we have to get the quantity. So we know that each row is actually TR. TR has children of type TD, and we are looking for fourth TD because the fourth table data TD contains the quantity. So row dot children and its fourth element, that is at index 3, that gives us the TD table data. Now we need its child, first element child, and first element child is the input field and we want its value. So that gives us quantity. Now we have to make this calculation inside the object and store this ID as its attributes. Put a comma over here. So now this object contains two attributes, ID and quantity, and we have to push this object into this empty array. So items to buy dot push this object, and outside this for each, once we have gone through all those rows, this items to buy is actually filled up with objects, and each of those objects is consisting of an ID for each of those rows and quantities for the respective rows. Now we need to make a fetch request to the server, this time a post request, along with this array as its body. So let's make a fetch request. Localhost 8080 backend myserver.php. Okay, now second parameter is an object. The method we are using is post. Let's set the headers. Content type application JSON, and it accepts application JSON data as well. Now let's send the body, which is going to be JSON.stringify, and we have to pass that array to it. Items to buy. Now the response of this fetch is going to be a promise, so I don't need to explain what I'm doing over here. Now this data, when it is returned from the server, it's going to contain a session ID. With that session ID, now we can make a request to the Stripe and request it to redirect the customer to their payment collection form. So for that we need an object of type Stripe, and for that we need to attach front-end Stripe JavaScript in the Index.html file. which is https://js.strippe.com version 3. So with this script file attached, now we can create an object of type stripe. Now this object requires our public API key, so let's go to the Stripe and get it. Let's go to the developers, API keys. This is my public key. Paste it. Now I can redirect my customer to the checkout form. Redirect to checkout. It needs an object. So session ID is going to be received from data.id. If you are confused what is happening over here, then I would suggest you to go and watch at least my first tutorial in this playlist, because I have explained this whole process in those tutorials in detail. Anyways, we are done with our front end. Now let's go and work with the backend. When this fetch request is received by the server, what is server going to do? We need to implement that logic now. So let's go to myserver.php. So this part is going to be executed if the fetch request received by server is of type GET. However, if the request is of type POST, then we need to define different logic. If the request method is POST, that means the request contains body with an array of objects, and each object has an ID and quantity attached with those objects. So we are going to get IDs from that objects, run a query against database, and we will search for the price of those products whose IDs matches with the one in the object. Get the price, multiply it with the quantity, accumulate the total, and then ask the Stripe to generate a session for us. Since the data is sent as a JSON, we need to extract it from the request. So let's define a variable where we are going to store that data. And the only way we can get the JSON data from the body is we have to use file get contents method with php:/input as its parameter. When we get that data, we want this to be passed to JSON decode method so that it's properly decoded. Let's create another variable to store total, semicolon. Now let's iterate over these item list elements. For each item list is item, get the ID and store it locally. So item.id, but because we have received it from the browser, so pass it through real escape string so that it gets converted into a string, just to be on the safe side. So this real escape string is actually a method of connection object. We have to do the same for the quantity. Now let's check the database if we have any such product with matching ID. So to do that, we have to execute query, and the query is going to be select price from products where ID equals, ID is coming from the ID variable, and then store the result of the query in result variable. Now if result is not empty, that is, it has returned num rows, in that case, convert that num row into associative array and store it in another variable. Let's name it row. So calling this fetch assoc on result is going to convert the result row into an associative array and storing it into a variable named row. Now we can say total equals current value of total plus price element of the row, and since it's multiply it with quantity. And since this quantity we have received from the front end and specifically from the input field of type number, so that means it's in the type string, we have to convert it into numeric value. So we have to pass this to int12 function. This is going to convert the string into integer value. So now our total is updated. However, if we don't receive any item with the matching ID, in that case we want to send back the message to the client that we are not selling any such item. So echo JSON encode, because our server only expects data of type JSON. So we are sending its status. No such product found. Then we want to exit. But if that is not the case, then outside that if statement, now we can make a request to the Stripe to create a session for us. And to make that request, we need a package of type stripe/stripe-php. So let's get that package first. Composer require stripe-php. Now let's include autoload. So our autoload is starting from the current folder. You have to go one hierarchy up. There we will find a folder named vendor, and inside that folder we have a file called autoload.php. Okay, now let's create an object of type Stripe. New Stripe. We are creating an object of type Stripe client. Now this Stripe client requires our secret key. So let me go back to my Stripe account. Copy, paste it. Okay, now using this Stripe client variable, let's create an object of type session. Now this create is going to take a lot of parameters. So again, I have explained them in detail in my previous videos, especially the first one. So I'll just quickly go through them. Success URL. If the Stripe payment is successfully deducted from the client, so this is where our Stripe will direct the customer to. So we want it to direct back to the landing page. Front end Index.html with the message attached, status equals success. In case something goes wrong and the Stripe couldn't deduct the amount from the customer's card, in that case we have to provide the cancel URL. So I want the customer to be redirected back to our landing page, but this time with the status of failure. We have to define the payment method types allowed. We are only using card as the allowed payment method type. Mode is payment. Now next parameter is line items. So this is basically going to contain the list of all the items that the customer is buying. So it's an array, and each line item contains two elements. I mean the required one, optional one can be many. First one is quantity. Since we have collected the payment, we are not going to include all the items that have customers bought over here because it's already very complicated. Arrays inside arrays inside arrays. It's going to be very complicated if we include all of those items that the customer has bought into this. So what we are going to do, we are going to make the Stripe know that customer has bought one item and its price is going to be the total price that we have calculated. So therefore we have to use the quantity 1. Now for the price data we have to use another array. So this is what I was talking about. It's complicated arrays inside arrays, and again inside that array there is one more array. So this price data contains 3 pieces of information at least. The first one is currency. I'm using Great British Pounds. Then the unit amount, like unit amount is what is the price of one piece of the item that you have bought. Then that will be multiplied by quantity, which is 1. So we are putting here our variable, that is total. Then the third piece is product data, which is again another array. So the only important bit of information or required field over here is name. So here you are supposed to write the name of the product that customer has bought, like t-shirt, perfume, or whatever it is. But since we have collected it as total price, so the name that I'm going to give is my grocery store's name. So grocery store. Description I'm putting, it's optional, but I'm putting, and I'm going to name it just your invoice for grocery today. Okay, so once this object gets created, the session object gets created, we want to send that session ID back to the client. So echo JSON encode, let's send it an array with ID, and the ID is stored in the session variable. Let's hope I haven't made any spelling mistake or missed out comma or anything, and let's see if we are able to successfully make a payment. 105. So we definitely have a button named checkout-btn. Okay, it's a class name, so I again forgot to put dot over here. Refresh, add to cart, view cart, checkout. So it has something to do with the server. Server.php not found. It's my server.php. It is my server.php. Oh, backend slash add to cart, view cart, checkout. Unexpected end of JSON input. I need to place this curly brackets over here before I'm creating the stripe object. While we are iterating through this item list, spelling mistake was there, so obviously I would have got another error. So while I am iterating through this item list array, go through one by one each of those elements, extract the IDs, and then fetch the price from the database and accumulate in the total variable. When we are done with this iteration, only then I want to create an stripe variable. So by mistake, this whole process I had created inside that iteration as well. This whole thing. So that's why I removed that curly bracket and put it over here. And let's see how many more mistakes I have done. Now there is something with the server response. Okay. Call to undefined method real escape string. S is missing on line 27. S and S. Unknown parameter success URL. So there is mistake. Success URL. Received unknown parameter line item. It's not line item, it's line items, plural. Okay, let's go back to the server. It says invalid array. Okay, I think the error is this line items is supposed to be an array of arrays. So let me cut this whole part. Put one more set of square brackets, and within those square brackets put everything back. So that's what I was talking about. It's very complicated. Refresh, add something to the cart, view cart, checkout. Finally, okay. So this is the total price that according to the items that we have bought we should be paying. Let me put some email through which we can identify our transaction. Okay, 112212. Okay, there. 123. Name is again QQQ. United Kingdom postcode. Pay. No thanks. Successful, and you can see status success has been appended to the URL. Now let's go and check our Stripe account and see if we have made this payment. Refresh. You can see 9.22 pounds, and this is a email address that we entered. So yes, we have successfully deducted this amount from the client, and that amount has been stored in our payments, our store's payment account. So with this, we are ending this tutorial. I hope you liked it. If you did, please if you did, please don't forget to subscribe, like, and share it with your friends. Thank you so much. See you until next time.